Hello, and thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to the first webinar series brought to you by the Centro Institute. My name is Ryan Manchi. I lead the Centro Institute, where we create educational programs and thought leadership initiatives to help raise your game. Hopefully, if you're joining us, you are familiar with Centro, but it is a new year and we have a slew of first-time attendees joining us for the webinar series. So to give you some background on Centro, we provide software for digital advertisers. Our technology is designed to boost team, media, and business performance by enabling advertisers to plan, buy, and analyze campaigns all on a centralized and collaborative system that we call Basis. We have an amazing team of 700 plus media specialists, data pros, operations wizards, account leaders, and digital experts who provide our clients with raving fan service at every stage of any campaign. We're happy that you joined us today, and we're lucky to have two speakers today. In addition to myself, I have the pleasure to be joined by my colleague and friend, Noor Nasir, who is Senior Director of the Media Innovations and Technology team and host of the increasingly popular podcast, AdTech Unfiltered, as well as an amazingly talented photographer. Noor, thank you for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to both the recording and the slides within the next 24 hours. We'll have some time as we near the end for any questions that you have. If you do have some questions that pop up throughout the presentation, you can ask those in the questions tab in the webinar panel. Our webinar is titled New Media Trends for 2020. It is a new year, a new decade, and the media and advertising industry continues to evolve and mature. And it really is the maturity part that stood out to me. And as Noor and I examined the space, really digging into reports, meeting with hundreds of agencies, advertisers, and technology partners, we both saw many achievements in the recent past, also in the imminent future ahead. We broke it down and really identified 5 themes that we believe that every marketer needs to watch for the year 2020. Those are the traditional media remix, future of the agency, reclaimed identity, seamless experiences, and finally, the new retail paradigm. With that, we're going to dive in, and I'm going to hand it over to Noor to take us through the traditional media remix.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. So let's go ahead and jump into traditional media remix. So there's been a change in formats more so than anything. I think for the most part, folks who have joined us today are familiar with all of these media types. They still exist, even if they don't look exactly like this. But if anything, they've changed from what we're seeing here to what we are seeing on the next slide right over here, right? So we're still enjoying all of those, what were once the traditional means of consuming media, whether it is text on something that is printed or it's radio. I don't know if anyone's recently seen a boombox, or if it is television. Now it's been any one of these experiences has now, in most cases, been digitized. And that's offered a lot of enhancements in terms of your user experience. You're getting better quality graphics, better quality picture, a faster rate with which you're receiving different types of premium content. But now there's a lot of benefits that come with that for the advertiser. And even though this is a trend that people have seen for some time, it's a question of us now seeing it come to fruition in a way that's going to impact every single advertiser, whether they were an early adopter in the 2010s, or if they really now are in a place where they need to bring it into their media plans today. So let's take a look at some of the trends that are taking place in the space. What are things you really need to take note of? So holistically, what's going on from a spend perspective? There's 9% growth in total media spend anticipated in the year 2020, which is great. But something to make note of is that none of that new growth is a result of traditional media. In fact, there is an expectation for continuous decline in the traditional category. It's not so big though. So one thing to note is that over the next couple of years, there's anticipated to be about an 8% decline in the traditional media categories, and roughly 2% decline this year in 2020. But something to also make note of is that 40% of all media dollars are made up of traditional media types, so things that are not considered to be in the non-digital category. So it's substantial, right? People, if they can spend there, they are continuing to spend there. But also to make note of is that last point, which is that 1/3 of all spending decline is expected to take place in the traditional media category by 2023. So we're expecting this pretty rapid decline to take place in the next couple of years. So what does that mean for advertisers? So let's go ahead and head to looking at what the Remix trio is going to be, and that is really falling into these 3 core categories. 1 being audio, number 2 being television, and number 3 being out of home. So let's go ahead and jump right into audio. So a first point to make is that we are consuming so much more digital audio at a rapid pace in the recent past and moving into 2020 as well. So one stat I wanted to point out was this one, that this year we're going to be spending an average of 84 minutes a day consuming digital audio by comparison to 80 minutes with traditional radio. Now at this moment that might feel like not a big jump, but actually there's been a pretty significant jump in the last couple of years. Just in 2016, we were consuming over, I want to say, 89 minutes of radio content a day, and by comparison, we were consuming just around 60 minutes of digital audio. So all of this growth is really taking place because people have really jumped on board with more and more digital audio consumption, whether it is the audio apps that are out there, like the Spotify's and Pandora's out there, and then also the popularization of podcasting. There are so many more reasons, whether it's the technology or the content that's available, that's led to this leap taking place. And along those lines, as far as what are the devices that are enabling us to consume so much more in these spaces, I don't think anyone is surprised to see that a lot of digital audio listening has historically taken place on desktops and laptops. That's the origin from where most people started consuming. But I think the real game changers in terms of us consuming significantly more has taken place because of that mobility aspect. So being able to listen to that audio wherever you are, whether you're on a jog, whether you're in the car, a mobile device is enabling that. Or the replacement of the traditional radio has become the smart speaker. So now we're able to listen in our homes in a new way and also have those added benefits of voice activation and other tech that empowers us not only as consumers, but also for marketers and advertisers to be able to get more data points to activate digital audio campaigns more purposefully. So a couple of things to think about as it relates to this, what I'm calling this ear evolution. Formerly, when people were buying traditional radio, there was a lot of disparate buying, right? You're examining many different stations and then collecting them together before actually building out a plan. And that's going to continue to exist for at least the short term, but now the advertisers that have heavily been relying on those audio experiences to reach the right consumer are going to, without question, need to shift over into the digital alternative. And the prevalence of some of these popular players, some of them I already mentioned, that have walled garden experiences like the iHeartRadios, the Spotify's, the Pandora's, when they're curating this singular experience where all of your different types of listening can take place in one, I'm calling it a single space or a single house, they're able to collect so much more data that is purposeful, that you can go ahead and build your campaigns off of. So whether you're considering the location, the type of content somebody's listening to, whether it's news, entertainment, it's music, it's when they're listening, it's the time of day, it's the day of week. Again, all things that have already existed in the audio space, but now it's happening at a rate that can't be ignored if formerly you were spending more time and energy putting those kinds of buys through traditional radio means. A second category to take a look at is digital out of home. Sometimes people have historically referred to this as billboards, and digital out of home is a big piece of that. So here we're taking a look at a chart that's highlighting how we're seeing growth year over year taking place in the digital out of home category. And one thing to note, and I actually had a chart earlier that highlighted this as well, is that every traditional media type, there's been a significant decline, like I mentioned earlier on. But technically, out-of-home / digital out-of-home is the only category that has shown growth. And that's because there's been many, not only complementary experiences, but updates to the technology in billboards and out-of-home in out-of-home units that have enabled and given more purpose to why advertisers want to spend there. So what we can see here in 2020, there's an expectation of growth in ad spend by 4.5%, and there is an expectation for continued growth into the foreseeable future. And what does this mean as far as delivering a more purposeful experience to actual consumers from the standpoint of advertisers? Well, the one thing that separates digital out-of-home from all the other traditional media types is the fact that you are not the owner of the media, like the mechanism itself. Rather, this is something that happens by way of an infrastructure that is set up by the actual media owners that are setting up all those different spaces. So the thing to take note of here is that now that that infrastructure has been laid out, where there are all of these digital boards that can take in data, that can be in many cases activating new and interesting information in real time, that dynamic quality is something that can more easily be passed along to the benefit of advertisers and subsequently to consumers. And 5G is a part of that infrastructural change that's going to help rapidly enable a purposeful ad to be served in something that's much closer to real time than anything out of home was ever capable of doing. And then finally, the traditional TV category. So I've really simplified this slide to showcase the gold side, which is TV spend versus everything else. And for the longest time, television has been king. TV continues to be king in many ways as far as the importance of sight, sound, and motion. But the big point to make here is that even television is seeing a significant decline, or rather a pullback in terms of the reach that you can reach people with, and then also how much you're able to spend there. So what are we doing alternatively now that people have been cutting the cord and turning away from traditional means of TV consumption? What we're doing instead is consuming a lot of what is often called an acronym form, SVOD consumption, or subscription video on demand. So you may not call it SVOD, you probably call it something like one of these cord cutting solutions. And I'm going to show a variety of options momentarily, but let's just talk a little bit more about what that growth is looking like. So here we're seeing over the last couple of years that people are turning to not just an SVOD service, but they're turning to multiple SVOD services. So a couple of stats here: connected TV delivered 5.5 billion hours of viewer consumption in 2019. And also, this is where people are now spending those dollars that they were formerly spending in the cable TV space. And finally, 74% of US households have at least one SVOD service. So here we're looking at what those examples are. I'm assuming for folks on the phone, you've heard of many of these different partners. Some of them you may not be using, but you've probably seen ads for them because they're all hitting the ground hard in what has often been called the streaming wars. So I've broken these out into two categories: the paid subscription model and then the ad-supported model. Now, I know that there are some partners on the left that either are aiming to have ad-supported options, but even if they do have ads, you do have to pay to leverage their services. So that's how I came up with the point of separation. And then on the right side, I think this is where I've seen the most growth, is the ad-supported options. They're really hitting the ground to put ads out there from an out-of-home perspective, even on television, to say, we have a free alternative. And when you have a free alternative, that means there's going to be plentiful opportunity for advertisers to capitalize on that because they are ad-supported. Whereas many of the paid subscription options on the left, they are not being crystal clear about when and if they're going to enable a model that is also going to accommodate advertising. So at this point, we're seeing the streaming wars really having a significant impact on giving us more TV opportunities to reach consumers, but we're still having the death settle as far as understanding how can we scale this in a way from a buying perspective that is similar to what we once did in the traditional TV space. So just to recap on this section, what are the takeaways? New media in so many ways is really old media. It's just been reborn. We like the same old types of content, but we want them in new ways. We want them in better ways. And as advertisers, we want to capitalize on the information that can be collected in their digital formats. There is upward potential for more sight and sound audiences. It's a question of people subscribing to the services of their choosing, whether that is audio or video. And then finally, there is more scale to be gathered here and quality to be gathered. We're going to see probably by the end of this year how these streaming wars and any other type of subscription models are going to impact what I'm calling the traditional media remix.
Super. All right, so as we get into the future of the agency, our next theme for 2020, one of the things that's fascinating, I guess you could call it fascinating, is that the agency and client relationship has really gone through some interesting challenges in recent years, from questions surrounding fees and a desire for greater transparency from many brands to agencies oftentimes either feeling or actually having to do more work for less billable time. Also things like in-housing or even fears around the potential of in-housing. So, what does the future look like for agencies and really for the industry? And I think it's interesting to think about the growth of the industry with consolidation and other market factors. When you look at agencies in the U.S., that's what this chart is illustrating, that there's not a trend of necessarily the number of agencies increasing in recent years. What there is a trend toward is the average number of agency employees growing. So think about that for a minute. So agencies relatively flat, as you can see, for the last really 10, 20 years, right after the kind of bubble pop back in early 2000, 2001, you saw a little bit of decline, but it's been relatively flat. But look what happened around 2010. You see that just continued increase of the number of employees. And so I really attribute this to kind of the growing complexity of the industry and agencies' attempt to address the complexity, putting bodies towards it, where they need more help, where complexity is kind of increasing things, they can put more and more people towards it. And I think the reality is that both consumer technology and behaviors, as well as marketing technology, has really changed how advertising can really be the most effective and efficient. I think everybody can agree there's value in what agencies bring, bringing those new ideas, the fact that they're independent from publisher platforms, that they know all these different partners that are out there. They've got those relationships with the technology providers, with those publishers, with the different unique data providers. And some of my favorites, the fact that they can make a brand be part of pop culture, right? To truly understand what that brand's all about. And then they also can help brands stay on top of things from an education perspective, and when it comes to the new tech and the new partners and new trends that are out there in the space. So there's value there, but there's also this amazing amount of pressure that agencies are under. And I love this chart. This is from a Marketing Land study from last year that kind of breaks down these challenges that the agencies are looking at. And I feel like the complexity that they're seeing in these challenges, they're very much interrelated. That agencies, they're trying to grow their business, they're trying to become more profitable, they're trying to attract and retain that great talent that's out there, while also trying to hopefully look to utilize maybe some of the automation, some of the marketing technology tools that are out there to become more efficient in terms of productivity and more effective with their campaign performance. So this is really where I think you're seeing this kind of transformation of the agency model and how it needs to continue really to evolve. And what we've seen from a Centro perspective and my own observations across the industry and folks that we work with and just kind of looking across the space is that there's really a few different areas that the most effective agencies are really taking advantage of. I think one, this idea of kind of new subject matter experts, identifying what those areas of excellence are and bringing those people on board so they can go deep, they can be that trusted resource both internally as well as to the clients. I think one of the biggest areas that we're seeing this, and I think is going to be huge in 2020, is that area around kind of data and analytics. You see some of the numbers here. Nearly 80% of marketers are stressing that importance of analytic capabilities when they're actually awarding new business or retaining an agency. I feel like this could be a key to success if you're looking for some secret sauce for any of the agency folks that are joining us today. And I think, unfortunately, we think about data, especially like an area of expertise or just kind of the whole idea of data. It's almost become this buzzword. And I believe that we're kind of there's this opportunity to expand a data and analytics practice beyond just kind of talking about it. It's something that more and more marketers are expecting, and it's something that agencies need to deliver on. So moving beyond just that buzzword side of it, but actually providing those insights from a planning perspective, from an execution perspective, as well as optimizations and analysis. I think the second area, this idea of integrating teams with kind of smarter cross-training, where once, if you're old enough, you got enough gray hair like me, you can remember in the industry where digital was kind of that group within an agency that was kind of shoved back in the corner, maybe on a different floor. And then more recently, you saw programmatic, or more kind of data-driven planning buying that was kind of a separate group altogether. And I think you've got these subject matter experts that are there, that maybe where there was a kind of center, a specialized group that was focused on this. But I think bringing some of those teams into the fold, offering that cross-training, and really thinking about establishing an environment within the organization of kind of interconnected competencies, and really thinking through how can we train people to better prepare themselves for the future, but also more proactively take the stance that us as an agency, as an organization, that we can be more proactive, be smarter about how we're working with our teams and how we're working with the various clients and initiatives. I think an area that we're seeing really great success, I talked a little bit about programmatic kind of coming in the fold, but I think with the proper education, training, support, onboarding, buy-in, this is all an area that you can see great success in some of those, quote unquote, traditional digital media buyers. They can take that on. It may take some time, but they can learn it. And I think it's exciting for many buyers that we've seen across many of the agencies that we work with. So I think this is an area we'll continue to see. The third and the final area that I feel like encouraging, agencies to take advantage of this idea of kind of practical innovation. And look across the best agencies, they really act as almost this consultancy. They're regularly proving their value. They're showing, hey, this is the impact that I'm bringing. They may talk about some of the shiny objects, but they're going to bring those new ideas that are truly strategic and that they're actually going to show meaningful return and show that there's great success with that. So I think those are a few areas to be able to kind of focus on. And I think as much as it's an imperative to invest in the people, agencies of the future really have to invest also in that technology to allow them to automate those manual tasks, to be able to drive both improvements through efficiency as well as greater efficacy. And I think, we've talked to you about Basis. We feel pretty confident that we've got a great solution for this, but it's definitely something exciting to see more and more automation as agencies prepare to kind of future-proof themselves and that kind of natural evolution that I think happens over time as new technologies and new forms of media become available. So when I think about the future of an agency and success, I think it comes down to investing in talent, both that current talent to cross-train, as well as attracting the new talent, especially those subject matter experts, particularly within the data and analytics department. I think the second area, ensuring that there's better alignment in performance, particularly when we think about things like more practical innovation, and with those new and improved initiatives that can deliver results that truly matter, that are going to impact the business and move things forward. And then finally, really looking to not add people because of the growing complexity that we've seen, particularly over the last 5, 10, 20 years, but really solve for that complexity through automation.
Okay, so our third category is going to be the reclaiming of identity. So I think it's a trend that everyone has been seeing constantly in the trades. Whether or not you work in media, you've been hearing about this as a consumer. This is one of the big points of concern for advertisers and marketers, is that users identifiable via third-party cookies will drop below 50% this year, and that's because of various types of regulation that are coming into effect. There's been, for the last few years, we've been hearing a ton about GDPR, more recently a lot about CCPA, and there's more on the horizon from a regulation perspective. So where is the origin of some of this coming from, and also what are we seeing as the shakeout of this? So one thing you've probably been seeing a ton of is that this is really sourced from concerns around privacy and the fact that people just don't know what it is that they're opting into, and they don't even know that there is an option, and sometimes there wasn't an option. So you've probably seen a ton of this on every website that you're going to, this opportunity to gather more information and know what it is that you're sharing and what you're not sharing. So people are looking for what? They're really expecting more transparency around what is being collected. They want the choice to participate or not to partake. And finally, they want to have more control around those things. So that's the perspective from the user. What is the impact of all of this from the standpoint of the advertiser? And so the impact of change really falls into two obvious areas when it comes to the fact that we can't use third-party cookies. It's one, it's the audience targeting that we have long known and many have loved that we can't leverage the same way, and then also the conversion attribution. So that being, what are those audiences that we've liked to target historically that we can no longer target quite the same way? Two popular ones that come to mind for me are behavioral targeting, seeing what you're doing as you're surfing across the web, and then also site retargeting. And there are many other ways in which people have been consolidating data and categorizing it into audiences that advertisers have long loved that we can't quite use the same way. And one thing to point out as it relates to that is that first point, that there isn't an identical workaround solution. If anyone is suggesting that they have a perfect workaround solution, it probably is in violation. No, it's definitely in violation of a lot of the regulations that have been put out there. People need to know what is being tracked, and any type of workaround that's identical to what cookies once did will not enable that. So what do we have to turn to? So a couple of points there. It's some of the other tried and true targeting tactics to build audiences that have already been used and that will continue to be used. So some of those include contextual targeting, the usage of PMP audiences, and PMP audiences being ones that are being built off of first-party data and then passed along, location targeting, which has long been a popular means of also building out audiences, and then machine learning that doesn't leverage cookies. And then finally, also implications from a measurement perspective. What do we have to think about there, and how is that also going to impact the way in which we're going to share back data? A lot of reporting moving forward, at least for the near future, is going to be more focused on context and or location, and there is some potential to offer information that is demographic and psychographic in some cases. And then also what's to come, what else are we going to get that's more specific? A lot of ad tech partners, Centro included, are working on cookieless conversion attribution solutions. So alternatives that are going to be coming into development that are not going to come in conflict with some of these regulations that are now coming into full effect. So more to come there from an identity perspective, and it's something that we specifically at Centro are tracking on a daily basis. More to share in that area.
Cool. Transitioning over to our next area around seamless experiences. So it is 2020, and much like the Jetsons prophesized, we are surrounded by robots. From the thermostats to TVs to lights to smart speakers to digital assistants, and soon our cars. Technology, it's everywhere. But some of the best technology, or at least from a consumer perspective, the best technology, it's the stuff that's not in our face. And I think this is a concept that some will call ambient computing, where always-on computers are running quietly in the background. So we're seeing this in our homes as they become smarter, but also in other parts of our lives. Like I mentioned, our vehicles, our offices, the buildings that we're in, and even with the devices and the platforms that we use every day are becoming smarter and more intuitive and really less obtrusive. So I think that there's this parallel between consumer technology becoming more ambient and then the growing desire amongst consumers for these experiences that's really what they're looking for or what they'll ultimately respond to when it comes to advertising. So there's this increased opportunities, I believe, for marketers to be able to really follow suit, be proactive with the unique ways of addressing consumers, that it's not so much about being in the consumer space anymore, but it's about something that's happening more in a natural kind of not in your face, more welcome, driving more engagement, stronger recall type of environment. So what does that look like, or what could it look like? Well, I think at a high level, I really like the concept of more dynamic storytelling with a greater level of personalization, really scaled across mediums and platforms, while also optimizing to deliver relevance to the consumer and really the performance of the advertiser. So this used to be something as simple as like an image and a headline being swapped. Maybe it's tied into a product feed, but really today, and what we're seeing going into 2020, is that it's evolved to really become so much more complex. It's become more data-driven to really marry these different signals, smarter targeting fed through really the programmatic ecosystem. So it's exciting to think about what worked for display now that it's available in other channels. So think like audio, where clips can be stitched together in variants based upon all these different triggers like location and weather and product availability, and also being able to pull in things like sequential messaging, again, across different mediums and platforms. And I think another area of less obtrusive advertising, something like around native and branded experiences that we've continued to see really incredible growth, and I think will be huge this year. And you can see the numbers are a testament to that, while ads will follow the form, the feel, the function of content, of media on which they appear, they've been around, obviously, for a while, but, these estimates, they're pegging native advertising to continue to grow by 20% this year. It's going to top over $52 billion this year just in the United States, which equates to about 65% of all digital display ad buying. So think about that. 65% of all digital display that will run this year in 2020 will be native ad. It's huge, and it just continues to grow year after year. And I think part of that is the consumer response, and it's also more and more marketers, more and more brands realizing that, hey, when it's done right, there's really something special about a native ad that doesn't feel like an ad, or at least an ad that's really interrupted your experience. So I'm excited about the continued growth in this space, especially with how the process has been streamlined through more automation and really removing that back and forth that was such a big requirement just a couple years ago. Another area, I think, similar, growing off the back of the native or branded content experiences, is around influencers. So, this idea of the self-proclaimed influencers, it may make us kind of gag a little bit, but really the impact of, these quote-unquote influencers that they have on their audience is incredible. So while you think about the idea of, your family or your friends really having that biggest impact on helping you discover and hear about some of those new products, those new services that are out there, our concept in the year 2020 of who a friend is has really changed. And it's changed with the rise of social media, particularly if you look at the group of those under the age of 40. So the number one source for both male and female, whether they're Gen Z, millennials, about where they're learning about these new products that they're interested in, it's social media posts from these influencers, which I think is just incredible. So whether you've got brands like American Express showcasing luxury living or and travel, or somebody like Beyond Meat hyping their plant-based meats to the masses, when we see someone really living a brand, using a product, and sharing these tips that seem like it's meant for really their inner circle of followers, we feel included, and oftentimes we feel compelled to maybe head to the grocery store to buy those sausages or sign up for a credit card that has those greater travel rewards. So watch this space to continue to mature, and maybe you too can be a micro influencer as the year continues. So a few kind of takeaways. I think all this talk about better customer experience, more of these conversations with consumers, I think it really comes to fruition as savvy marketers are thinking less about how can I sell more of product X through portending a certain lifestyle, and more about and actually providing a better life and a better experience. So I think that can start with less obtrusive advertising, more seamless type of experiences, and really expand to truly impactful impressions across mediums.
All right. So our last category is the new retail paradigm. So the point I'm making here is that it's no longer guaranteed that if you put up a storefront that people are going to show up in masses because it's just locally accessible and they were able to see it. So something that, again, another trend we've been seeing a ton of in the recent past and that's continuing to develop is this essentially retail apocalypse. Now, I do want to say again that this isn't something that is strictly and only affecting the retail category. I'd say the retail category is taking on the brunt of the burden here. But anything else where an advertiser or a brand is going to have some sort of physical space, they need to be aware of some of the things that we're going to talk about. So the big trend, over 9,000 store closings took place in 2019. A lot of popular household name brands are included in that category. So there's long been word about Sears and Kmart in particular, but some of these other players as well, Barney's, Gap, Family Dollar, Forever 21. The Forever 21 across the street from where we're sitting right now at this moment has recently closed. And they're filing for bankruptcy, and it's because they have this massive footprint and people just are not coming into stores and buying the way that they once did. So what have we been pointing our fingers towards as far as why this retail apocalypse is taking place? And it's so often said that it's those direct-to-consumer players, they're the disruptors. This popularity of disrupting categories continues to trend, and obviously because of that massive retail footprint, that brick-and-mortar footprint where there's very high costs that ultimately need to be passed along to consumers, a lot of these folks had early wins. Not on this list, but I have a couple of big ones here. Warby Parker, but additionally Glossier, Casper, Indochino, Untuckit. Actually, the first place I heard of Untuckit was in an airplane, in one of those like fly in the sky, look at this is an alternative means of you consuming something, not going into a physical store. But incidentally, the new trend has become, and I'm sure many of you guys on the phone have seen this, that these disruptors whose claim to fame was that you don't need to go into a physical space or a retail space to have this experience. Now they're starting to create some of those physical spaces. And the reason why that needed to happen is because there are many aspects of a retail space that still have value to the consumer. So what some of these disruptors or digital first players have started doing is creating pop-up shops, if not actual brick and mortar stores. So what are some of the key purposes that they've been noting as they continue to offer digital first experiences but start breaking into the physical category? It's that physical spaces enable a type of inspiration and education that you just can't lend to the consumer when you don't have them in a physical space with branded ambassadors. Number two, you're enabling another type of socialized experience. So people who are brand enthusiasts for that category that started off entirely digital can now share the wealth of that experience that they're enjoying with other enthusiasts. And if it's more of the pop-up play as opposed to a permanent physical space, it can be more cost-effective, you can lighten the risk, and there can be easier entry or access to being able to test and learn and see how important is retail going to be a part of the landscape of the journey that we want to share out with our consumers. So some things to think for from the standpoint of advertisers. It seemed like the answer was digital all the time. Always go digital. When in doubt, go digital. Heavy up on digital. How can we make sure that retail or physical spaces become less and less important? But if anything, I think we're learning that both experiences are equally important, but there are unique considerations you need to account for the unique category that you play in. So manage what the expectations are around the purpose of retail. Kind of like we were saying earlier about the importance of inspiration and education. education is a big piece. What are those touch points that someone would need that physical in-person advice for? You know, something that I think of right now is like from a tax perspective, like do people need to go into a physical store? Do they feel comfortable just getting help over the phone or through some digital experience? What does that look like for the type of consumer that any particular brand or advertiser is looking to attract and retain? So that's something to keep consideration for. Number two, anywhere where it would make sense to offer digital engagement and functionality, you need to think about what that should look like. I was just talking to Ryan before we started the webinar of saying if he was about to go to a physical space to grab lunch, and we realized suddenly right before he left that we want to know what we can go ahead and do as it relates to the physical space we're in right now, that being our office, via computer, via a digital experience, to speed up the process of ordering that lunch, right? So making sure we have access to that information is what ultimately influenced where we decided to go. So again, making sure that functionality is there, figuring out what that right split looks like. In some cases, maybe you do heavy up intensely on digital and retail footprint isn't that important, but it can't just be neglected. So in so many ways, there is an importance to considering both driving people into physical locations and also continuously thinking of how can we accommodate that transaction in a digital space. So finally, some execution opportunities that have already been brought to life in the last couple of years, but continue to be prominent and important. So like I've been saying in previous sections, if you haven't adopted these things yet, there's even more purpose to do them today than there has been historically. One of those categories that sometimes people have been naysayers around has been the augmented reality category. So popularly, IKEA has been known for doing a lot of stuff in the AR space to showcase what, let's say, some of their products can look like inside of your home. That can apply to a lot of other categories with some creative thinking. And because everyone has the technology you need to implement augmented reality, that is your mobile device on hand, making sure that when and if it makes sense to give people that opportunity to better assess, get into, let's say, the mid-funnel to increase their purchase consideration, taking advantage of AR when it makes sense. Number two, I think a lot of advertisers are already doing this, but doing location visitation following ad exposure. We're seeing tons and tons of advertisers doing it, but in some cases where it isn't happening, making sure to do it, and then also making sure to take advantage of the additional attribution and analytical information and insights that we can now make available today. And then also app verification. People are downloading apps at an astronomical rate, and then they're finding more purpose because they're adopting some of the things that I talked about earlier as far as finding that brand experience or that, you know, whatever that app experience is that is meaningful to them with a greater regularity. So those can be really telling as far as being able to capitalize on that data from an audience standpoint and then reaching the right person at the right time. And then finally, like I mentioned earlier, going ahead and driving people not just into stores, but also online. It just depends on, is there an opportunity to offer them something that's differentiated, or when do you want to offer them an identical experience, but just enabling them to do what makes sense for them based on their personal journey. So a quick recap here. I'm going to start off with my points. So privacy considerations, they are beyond initiated. They are now implemented. So the audience shakeout as far as what we can actually do as advertisers, there are some things that we can do that we historically could do, but now as far as being able to do things that might be closer to what we historically did, that's still to come. So there's more to be seen there. We're going to continue to keep track of new updates as we especially come up with solutions here at Centro. Secondarily, the convergence of both consumption and buying, so making sure that you're taking consideration of the fact that people want to shop in physical spaces and consume things, but they also sometimes want to be able to get quick access to that online. So what is the experience that you need to offer to that consumer based on their journey? And then finally, also balancing the physical and the digital. How do you make sure you're offering both experiences to a consumer, whether they want to use one exclusively or they ultimately are going to use both?
Perfect. And I think, you know, from a the agency perspective, we think about the future of agencies really looking at more automation, that, no longer can we continue to just throw bodies at some of these challenges, some of the complexity that's occurring and has occurred within the industry, that we need to find ways to utilize technology smartly, not necessarily to replace people overall, but replace some of those future challenges that will be more and more difficult to embrace. It's just not an efficient way to be able to solve the problems there. And also seeing some more investment when it comes to data and analytics. And then finally, that idea that ads will become more seamless. I think the advertisers that embrace this sooner rather than later will see greater impact, greater performance, greater recall, greater engagement with those ads that are truly experiences less interruptive, less obtrusive, and something that can actually delight consumers in that ultimate experience. So as we wrap things up from the presentation, we will move into our Q&A time. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, note that there's a question tab in the webinar app. It should be on the right side. You can submit your questions there, and we will try to do our best to answer the questions that you have. Let me take a quick look. We've got quite a few that are coming in, so I appreciate that. Just trying to kind of go through some of these. Nora, if you see one that jumps out at you, feel free to jump in. Here's one that I kind of like, this idea around automation being adopted across the industry. It's why do we think it's not been adopted more? I think one, just the definition of it. I think what that looks like. I tried to define it there. I think there's new technology that needs to be available. I mean, I know I can speak from a basis perspective. It was only released within the last several years, but we're seeing some good adoption. I think I'm reminded of a story, I guess, when elevators were first introduced in like the late 1800s. People were fearful of kind of the automated elevators. They wanted operators to be in there. So I think maybe there's a little bit of fear similar to that around what true automation ultimately looks like, that maybe we can overcome that a bit. So, gosh, there are so many to try to get through.
We might have to send some follow-ups.
Yeah. We're definitely going to have to get through. So I think, seen any that jump out to you, Nora? So I guess there were some questions here around browser and cookies will be affected. I know you talked a bit about that. Any additional comments there on like kind of what that impact may look like?
Yeah, I mean, something that we had also discussed previously when we were trying to condense the slides is that there are some, this is the tough thing, right? It's very much a catch-22. Every time we've talked to advertisers, even in the last several years, well before GDPR and CCPA were even on the table, I think a lot of advertisers were saying, the volume of data that's being collected, that's not even sufficient enough to suffice my appetite. I'm hungry for even more data. I'm looking for even more specific information. And I think that there's this weird line that we don't always have an appreciation for what is direct marketing, where I know exactly who I'm reaching, versus what is advertising, where there is something a little bit abstract about the audience I'm looking to reach. And I think this is a conversation we need to readdress in today's day and age, where we don't have a choice to go back to what we once did. Something to note, and I don't know if I mentioned it earlier on, but Google Chrome, which is debatably one of the most popular, if not the most popular web browser out there, they are doing a little bit of a slower transition out of going ahead and sunsetting the third-party cookies that they have long used, as all web browsers have. So there's technically a little bit of time to adjust as far as there still being some means of using third-party cookies in the way that we once have. But at the same time, we have to go ahead and adjust. We have to get on board with the fact that we can't do what we once did, and we have to really think, like, why is it that we, what are some of these new categories, or what are some of these categories that were historically available? what has prevented us from starting to use them in a more plentiful way? How can we adjust and tweak them so we can use them purposefully to reach the right types of audiences? So again, there's more to shake out on that. I think this has been a type of disruption that people were not anticipating. So as Centro continues to develop what some of those audiences could look like, there will be more follow-ups.
Perfect. So there's a few questions about the kind of retail side, and I think it's interesting. I feel like a lot of learnings, not just within the retail space, but I think for other types of brands kind of thinking about that. This comment is a little bit more focused on the retail space. It says, for every store closing, another opens. We can't just identify closures. I think we probably can all agree with that. Many, including those like Amazon, are opening in droves. You could maybe argue that a little bit, but like thoughts on that. I think it kind of goes to your point, right?
100%, right? And I've seen that specifically from trades that specialize in the retail space, that they are continuing to emphasize that, believe it or not, the vast majority of shopping that does take place happens in retail stores. I even think of my own habits. Yes, do I buy many things online? I do, but do I continue to go into physical stores with regularity? Absolutely. And I have seen some of those statistics around the fact that as stores continue to close, new stores open, but they have new purpose and they modify and consider for the fact that they are living in a more digital age, and there are new things they need to accommodate in order to stay afloat that maybe historically people were not as cognizant of. So very much have an appreciation for that. And then also, like I was mentioning earlier, a lot of these disruptors that wanted to be all digital all the time have had some trouble sustaining the levels of growth that they historically had by only having a digital presence. So I 100% am on board that having those physical spaces and retail spaces, it makes sense, but you do have to put a lot more forethought on when and how you want to build out that footprint for your particular category.
I think there's a couple of questions about different targeting. Here's one that I think is kind of interesting, that we're currently in the last age of digital transition with various demographic audiences, older boomers, millennials with varying levels of digital confidence and spending. What is the proper balance of new and traditional media? There's some others about, again, targeting different audiences, things like that. I mean, my initial take is that there's not a simple answer, and I think that's probably why you didn't hear it today. You got to put X towards what is still traditional today, and Y towards digital, and break it down this way. I know our approach is very much doing the analysis of who are we looking to target, where are they, looking at all these different factors to really properly plan towards what is that right balance. What does that look like? There's that art and science, even though it's kind of a beaten down type of term, but very much that approach to kind of thinking what's going to be most appropriate, whether it is an older audience that may not be as technologically sound and aware of things, or a younger that is constantly on digital and there's no other way to be able to connect with them. Any additional points there that you have, Nora, around that?
Yeah, just saying that this is a trends presentation, but also a presentation where we're just thinking more about the future, is that I think sometimes we have this bias that older audiences are less technologically savvy. And I'm not saying that there isn't truth to that advertisers and brands have seen the impact of, but I do think as time goes on, naturally, I assume many people feel this way, that those older audiences are just going to be so much more savvy and educated. And so there's going to be more rhyme and reason for being able to share digital experiences with them. I also think there's a big education component, right? So it sometimes has less to do with age, but really giving people clear instruction on how it is that they should be engaging with your brand. Sometimes I think there's these missing pieces where people don't, like, so there's some sort of like digital experience has been shared with the consumer, but there's some missing link as far as making it crystal clear how you should be engaging with them, and that's really going to help get people to the bottom of the funnel faster. If only those things were being solved for a variety of different ways in which people were having their customer journey with that particular brand or advertiser, they would be able to see more success. So again, that it's such a broad look at the question, because there are, like Ryan was saying, so many things to consider based on your category, based on the cities that you're serving, based on the age and demographics, sociographics, and so on and so forth.
Perfect. couple of questions about, I think some of the things that you talked about from a identity perspective and being able to track whether it's conversions without a cookie or track location visitation following an ad exposure. Those are kind of meaty, more technical types of things, but maybe kind of broad coverage for each of those.
Wait, so
I guess the first tracking visitation, kind of foot traffic following ad exposure. I think with different partners that we work with.
Absolutely. So to Ryan's point, it is its own entire topic. We could do an entire webinar on that specific area. And I know that there are going to be folks on the phone who have already been doing a ton in the location attribution and location targeting space, and that there are folks for whom maybe it's a newer opportunity. But the very short elevator pitch version of it is that location data in various different forms of granularity are constantly being collected on people's devices. In fact, there is actually some privacy considerations around that as well, but location data collection continues to be a popular means by which we are able to formulate audiences to say, you're in the right place at the right time, now let's serve you the right message. So it's an opportunity to target a consumer for whom a message is going to be the most relevant. And then also seeing where that person goes in some set time frame, and do we want to send them to a physical space, and do we ultimately see them showing up at that physical space because we have that technology that we're able to gather from the mobile device that they most likely have on hand with them. So that's really the elevator pitch for mobile location and for mobile attribution. But we are continuing to see a lot of new data points that are being pulled from that. So things we've talked about historically are not only knowing if you showed up within a particular window of time. Did you show up at a store after seeing an ad in 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 8 days, 10 days, depending upon what that window appropriately would be for your category. But then when did you go to the store? What day of week was it? What time was it? How long did you stay for? Is there other information we can now subsequently capture thereafter? So that is continuing to develop, and it's a very popular means, especially for folks that have, again, a very heavy physical brick and mortar or retail footprint. They want to know when people are going to a particular location after they've been served an ad, because stores continue to be popular even in 2020.
Perfect. I think we've got time for a couple more. This one, automation to me means people being put out of work. How can this be adopted without leading to massive technological unemployment? I think I can kind of understand that perspective, but it's actually an area that I disagree respectfully. That I think, what we've seen from an advertising automation perspective, just in my purview from a Centro and Basis perspective, is it elevates those people for more critical thinking. I think for too long, especially educated, smart, highly productive individuals that work within our industry, when you remove some of those kind of menial tasks that they're required to do, working between all these different platforms, all these different systems, they're able to offer higher level strategy, better thinking, better interaction with the client, better interaction across their team, able to learn new skills. So it actually creates greater opportunities for them and for the organization. So it's not a fear that I have. I think the agencies, the folks that we work with that have adopted our automation tools, they've seen great success with it, increased productivity, greater happiness amongst their organization, and actually winning new business. So it's all around a win-win for everybody. A little bit of a different turn here. This one for Nor that I know she loves talking about. She actually wrote a really brilliant blog post a few months ago on 5G affecting digital advertising. He talked about it from a digital out of home perspective, which I think is such a great perspective, one that I hadn't necessarily considered. But what about some other areas that you feel like 5G, the greater speed, what kind of impact could we potentially expect there?
The funny thing about 5G is that whenever people talk about it from a forward-thinking standpoint, it's that this bandwidth and this speed, what it's going to enable are things that we can't even quite envision. Like, it was more clear with 4G, that transition from 3 to 4G or 2G to 3G, that there's going to be greater speed, and we have very significant issues as far as getting the types of speeds we need to see fluid video, to have downloads of different types of content we want to consume at a pace that is going to hold up with what the consumer is expecting. But for the most part, depending upon where you live, a lot of people have pretty good, internet speed, and they're able to consume a lot of content at a rate that they're comfortable with. So this is all to say that the expectations around 5G is like, we don't even know how people are going to be able to use it, but it's always that we don't know what we don't know until suddenly we have access to it, and then we become the beneficiaries of what that looks like. So one thing I have heard on some occasions is that when you live in a city that is like a large metropolis, then you become the beneficiary of very fast internet speed. But there are actually a lot of parts of the country where the speeds haven't quite taken effect. So I do think that the launching of 5G and additional technologies are going to enable more people to have that speed that they're expecting. And there's just going to be so much more video content consumption and video creation that is going to take place. So with that continuing to play a role in our lives, I think video is going to be a heavy space where exactly where that's going to formulate and how that's going to shake out for us as consumers, we're going to see. I'll have to update you guys later into 2020.
Awesome. Thank you, Noor. We've got about 50 questions that we were not able to get to, so I apologize if you asked the question. We will follow up, provide some clarity there. And depending on some of the questions, maybe we'll do kind of a follow-up, wrap-up blog post or something like that, but we'll follow up with every one of you individually as well. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Noor, for your great insights. This concludes our presentation for today. When you log out, you will receive a survey, and I greatly appreciate you giving us some feedback on your experience, on some suggestions for future topics. Many of you asked the slides. Yes, they will be available as well as a recording of today. It will be sent to you via email within the next 24 hours. Plan to join us. An email will be going out within the next week or so for our next webinar on February 26th, where we will focus on the green rush, cannabis advertising. So until then, I am Ryan Manchi. This has been the webinar series brought to you by Centro Institute, and we're glad you joined us.